Hello everyone, I'm here with the amazing Rebecca Schwarzlose. I hope I said that accurately, on the most part. Rebecca is a neuroscientist at Washington University in St. Louis, and she's the author of Brainscapes. Brainscapes was supported by a grant from the Public Understanding of Science and Technology program of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. It's a mind blow of a book, and it really covers such an amazing gray area for me, and literally a gray area of our mind, in how does the brain work and what the brain is. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Alex.
Absolutely, it's an honor. And as I was mentioning, Brainscapes is really just a breathtaking journey into the map our brain is. So I would like to hear, Rebecca, what inspired you to have this pursue into how our mind works and what our brain really is.
Sure. Uh, uh, so to start way back, I guess I was drawn to neuroscience and psychology and the mind and brain from a kind of a young age, just very interested in how we think and how we perceive the world. And also kind of interested in how kind of changes in the brain can change people's perception and experience of the world, such as in mental illness. So kind of always found it very interesting and sort of naturally wanted to go into that field. In graduate school, I wound up doing neuroimaging research. That's what I do now as well. But I was studying specifically object processing. So, kind of how does our brain make sense of the shapes and objects that we kind of collect information about with our eyeballs? and and at the time with that research, I was working with Dr. Nancy Kanwisher at MIT. She's a pioneering researcher in the field, and we identified and named this brain area that is on the kind of bottom surface of the temporal lobe, so kind of under and inside where the ear would be. And this area is highly selective for look for processing images of bodies or body parts. And I know that sounds sort of weird and creepy. It doesn't mean that anyone is running around without a head or decapitated or, random fingers, but just that when you see, and, in our daily lives, we see plenty of parts of the body, like I'm gesturing now with my hands. And we gather information from the body and what it's doing, and we can also helps us to tell who we're seeing, maybe from a distance or from behind. And anyway, so this area is right next to another area that's very, very selective for representing faces. It's very important for the recognition of faces. And if you damage that part of the brain, you have this profound loss in your capacity to recognize the faces of others, even your family, your children, yourself in the mirror. Um, so what I found really intriguing was that these two areas were always, just kissing. They were always right next to each other in individual brains. And that adjacency kind of intrigued me because there's some variability in exactly where certain things tend to land in the brain. And that started me on a kind of a quest of really investigating sort of why do things land where they are? What is the organization? And that brought me to really kind of deeper dive into these amazing maps that we have, maps that lie all over our brain and mediate a lot of what we do.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you for being so curious because you shared your work with us, and it's really an eye opener into how our brain really works and what the brain really is. And in Brainscapes, you mentioned how the maps from our brains were found. And it's a really amazing story. That's how you begin your book, Brainscape. So, would you like to share with us, like a sneak peek into how this was found?
Sure. Well, there are many different maps in the brain. So some of the kind of biggest and oldest that we've known about for the longest period of time, we've learned about from the 1800s. And I can tell you kind of about the first one, but I'll say that there are still scientists are still discovering new ones today. It's obviously a little easier now. We have MRI machines and we can do brain scans and we have all these technologies. But the way that it used to work is that you could really only learn about the human brain by the damage that happened to it when people had misfortunes that occurred to them. So, if they had strokes or they had traumas due to war, or they had conditions that created kind of internal disruption of the brain. So, the very kind of earliest discovery of a brain map in the human brain was done by John Hewling Jackson, and he had a lot of patients with epilepsy. He was a neurologist in Britain, and his patients, he kind of just observed. He would observe their symptoms and sort of how their seizures would spread through their body. So they would
Yeah.
start every patient that he got with these kind of classic kind of tremor seizures that would influence their body would start in one part of their body, and then they would sort of spread to other parts of their body. And as he observed this in different individuals, he realized that the seizures always spread in a certain pattern. And he kind of made this really brilliant leap to saying that pattern that we see of the seizure in the body is reflecting a pattern of how movements in the body are laid out in the brain. And that
Wow.
turned out to be correct and was verified soon after.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's really, really impressive to think how, our body really is a feedback into what's happening in the brain, and the other way around too, how the brain is a feedback into what the body is saying to us. And I'm very curious to know, there are so many maps, there's so many things that we can cover.
So these many of the brain maps that I talk about in the book are really like the foundations of how we perceive and what we feel, and how we move. But one of the things that so we find them in people irrespective of whether they have different kind of psychiatric illnesses or kind of personalities. They're really quite universal. We even find many of them in flies and frogs and dogs. Um, but what but there is kind of a feedback aspect to our maps, so that there are other parts of our brain that are so many of the maps that I describe are taking information that we get from the receptors in our body, in the back of our eyeballs and in our cochlea and on our skin, that's telling us what's happening in the world around us. And that helps us to perceive. But we also use the same maps in our brain to imagine and sort of to attend, to modulate our attention toward different things that are happening to us. So we have this internally generated sort of system that allows us to kind of obviously like imagine a new thing, but
Yeah.
also sort of to react to an environment differently depending on our current emotional and physical state. And so that can also change the activity in these maps, which can affect how we feel and how we perceive.
Yeah, absolutely. And going into the foundations of brainscapes and into the foundations of mapping, you mentioned the you know the mappings of vision, touch, sound, taste, and smell. So, which one of those is your favorite one? Which map's your favorite one?
Um, I would have to say that vision is my favorite in part. In I love them all. They're all my babies.
Yeah, it's
But
an
vision, I
unjust
think, has
question.
yeah. But I think vision, I like to describe maps in terms of vision in a way because we are such visual creatures, and kind of more than other senses. Those of us who are seeing individuals rely very heavily on sight. And so to some degree, it's a little easier, I think, to kind of explain how a visual map works. And we also know a little more about it than we know about many of the other maps. It is just the visual, the kind of largest visual map that is in the back of our brain is just very well studied in humans and in animals. And it's kind of conserved across human and animals, so very similar in many ways across species. So it's something that we know more about, which is just kind of fun from the perspective of being able to describe it to others.
Yeah, of course. And prior to reading Brainscapes, I didn't think of the eyes being the brain. But they're kind of the brain, no? The eyes are the brain.
Yeah, I mean, the retina, the kind of the sheet of cells at the back of your eye, there's kind of a few layers of cells, and those are neurons, just like the cells in your brain. They're special kinds of neurons, but they are receiving information, collecting information about photons or packets of light entering your eye, and then translating. And even within the retina, they're already starting to do computations, so that as that information gets sent back to the actual brain, it's already starting to be processed. And so it's like a helpful boost already. So absolutely. And really all of our sensory receptors are kinds of neurons. They're specialized kinds of neuronal cells that in many ways kind of operate and function like the neurons in our brain. So we really do have like kind of an extension of our brain throughout our body in these receptors that collect information.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really, really mind blowing. And one of the things that I try to do here is just connecting ideas from your work and trying to put more depth into in terms of other previous guests that have been here. And one of those has been Anil Seth, who's also a neuroscientist, and he argues that we have a collective hallucination. We live in a world that really isn't reality. It's just the closest approximation of what reality is. So, what do you think on that? Do you think that our brain really does see the world as is, or tries to make it so that we function the most that we can in reality?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our brain is constructing our reality. I wouldn't call it a hallucination because it is heavily founded upon the information that we're gathering from the environment. But if you study the brain and also if you study the environment, you realize that there is a tremendous amount of information that is, coming into us that we are effectively blind to, that we are not collecting, that then we are not processing, that we discard or lose or never had to begin with. There are even senses that other creatures have, that it can see in infrared or ultraviolet, that we don't have at all. So tons of information that's just lost. But even once we do gather the information that we can gather with our senses, we kind of make what we can of it, and that involves both sort of prioritizing some information over others because it's more relevant for our behavior and survival. Um, and it also involves the fact that our kind of ongoing internal state will affect how we respond to new information, and that will change how we kind of perceive it and how we interpret it. So it is very much kind of consciousness is, or what we're our conscious kind of perceptual experience is crafted, is constructed. It's not a veridical representation of our world,
Wow,
which is
that's
it is a little mind blowing. But luckily, I wouldn't call it a hallucination. I would call it our own kind of version of this world that we have kind of tried to optimize for our own uses.
yes, of course. And like you say in Brainscapes, and as we were saying now, our brain is thousands of years in the process, in the making. So it has an evolutionary code that we really don't price in into our daily interactions. We don't take, as you mentioned with an awesome example with Mona Lisa, how we really don't see Mona Lisa, some of the things that are there, but truly do happen in a fractions of seconds that cue emotional responses for us. So that's amazing. How do you think we're failing to price in the evolutionary code our brain has in today's world and our interaction with it?
Ooh, that's a big question. Let's see. Um, I think we do. I think on scales large and small, we overestimate our capacity to see and know. And I think that that causes short-sightedness on a lot of different levels. And you know, I think one thing that I talk about in the book that I think is um, kind of counterintuitive is that we as children, like our brains are very similar to the brain of a toddler in terms of sort of its basic organization and the basic foundational maps. And a lot of what our brain layout is like is kind of laid out in that very early time when we're infants. And then it stays kind of similar throughout life. It doesn't drastically change later in life. And so what we're doing as adults is we are taking kind of these foundational maps that become set relatively early in life, and we are eking more out of them. And what that means, I think, is that um, while the evidence shows that we use our maps, we think analogically quite a bit. We think about, for example, we often think about something like time in relation to space. So we have maps in our brain for space that allow us to keep track of what's around us, and we
Wow.
can use that to keep track of things like what happened when,
Yeah.
and we do that in a spatial fashion, or using our kind of our bodies to do things like counting, and then harnessing maps that are related to space body awareness or kind of neighboring to those areas that allow us to then kind of keep track of numbers without counting on our fingers. So all of that to say, I think that a lot of how we understand our world is shaped by our kind of our early beginnings as young babies, and it's a very physical kind of foundation upon which we try to build our understanding of abstract concepts, things that we can't touch or feel, things that could be highly complex and not physical. And so we are kind of constrained, and we sort of struggle to understand a lot of things, or kind of, you know, um, we don't do great about saving for retirement and understanding the stock market, or
Hmm.
understanding kind of something like COVID-19, or complex things that are difficult. And sometimes I think we underestimate how little and how poorly we understand these things. So that can become a problem if we trust our own instinct over experts, or we place our trust in someone who doesn't have expertise on a particular topic, especially like kind of scientific, economic things that are really complicated. So that can create, I think, larger problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really impressive to think, how mapping in our minds, mapping in our brains really does have an impact in how we interact with others, with the world around us, and how we process information. There was one example that you explained in Brainscapes, how a man knew what a carrot was but couldn't picture it in an image. There was no image for him to identify as a carrot. So this is amazing. And one of the big themes of your book is what we can do about this. We're not just stranded into, this is life and there's no way of helping them, but you further explain on technologies that are being developed into how can we help them make sense of reality and plug into reality, quote unquote. So what are some of the biggest technological advancements that really excite you for the future of the brain?
Well, there are many fronts in which brain technology. So I think you're describing brain computer interfaces, which I'll call BCIs. That's kind of the acronym for them, uh, by which they are kind of they're developing in many different spheres and for different purposes. And there are a lot of reasons to be excited about them. There's also still many other challenges that they kind of remain for them to overcome. Um, so so, kind of first, to sort of set the stage with brain computer interfaces, I talk about them in the book because these brain maps that I described, which are spatial layouts of representations in our brain that reflect properties of our world, like our visual field, or what we can see, or the surfaces of our body, or how our body can move. And so these properties are actually kind of related to locations in our brains. And the upshot of that for someone who wants to develop a new technology is that without knowing you or really knowing anything about you, I already kind of could roughly say where in the brain you do things like generate visual perception that I would then be able to manipulate, right?
Wow.
So so I could put an electrode array on the back of your head, and I could stimulate your brain, and I could make you see light that wasn't there, because I know that that part of that map in the back of your brain for visual processing is mediating your perception of light. And if I were to kind of suppress activity in that map, I could make you fail to see things that are right before your very eyes.
Hmm.
So in that way, and the other thing that I can do, so that is creating or changing activity in your brain, and that's one thing that BCIs can do. But BCIs also can read information out of your brain. So in this case, I can have my electrodes, and you can set them instead to be basically listening to the ongoing activity in your brain. Um, this kind of um, this kind of system is can be very powerful, but there are still a lot of limitations, usually because of the fine-grained organization within these maps and the way that when you get really nitty-gritty, the details differ for between individuals about like the layout once you're really kind of fine-grained.
Wow.
It's much harder to read out something like, I know exactly what you're looking at by just looking at your visual cortex, your map. But in a scanner, we can do things like we can show somebody a bunch of pictures, and then we can tell just by looking at their brain activity and where their brain activity is, where the activity is at certain times, that, oh, this is when you're seeing a face because you're getting activity in that face area, and that
Hmm.
kind of activity is ramping up. So there are information that we can read out of the brain. Um, and all of this is kind of within the the context of helping people. So a lot of this like development is trying to move toward being able to give people who are paralyzed some ability to control neural prosthetics or prosthetics with their brain, so they can think about moving, and because there's electrodes in their motor cortex listening, it can send a message to a robotic arm which can do what they want it to do, and
Wow.
some of that is already being done. I mean, it's pretty amazing, but it still has a very kind of, it's still limited in terms of sort of long-term capacity, and whether it's something that you can take your robotic arm and go to the grocery store with it, is
Hmm.
different. Is that you'd be, but within like a fixed setting, there's been a lot of progress with that kind of technology. It's amazing.
No, wow, wow. That's mind blowing. And, we're discussing the positive aspect of it all, how can really make an impact in people who really need it the most. And there's a double edged sword with this, as you argue in Brainscapes. There's this new world that we live in, which we're plugged in 24/7, which is social media, it's our technologies, it's pretty much everything. It's a 24/7 access, I like to put it that way in terms of your ideas, to our neural data, our neural connections, our stimuli. So, Becca, tell me, this there's this potential of harvesting neural data for commercial uses. What's happening here, and what are some of the downsides of this?
Right. So that's a great question. We already know that we have a problem with privacy in our society, and we enjoy the benefits of having use of resources, software, websites. We get our Google accounts or YouTube. We're on, and we can use these things for free. And part of the reason that they're free, or Facebook, so many, they're free because they also are receiving information about our choices, and the information that we disclose um, becomes information that has value to large companies, because that tells them something about what products we might want to buy. and it gives information that can then be used for marketing, right? So that companies who want to sell to something that I might want to buy, we can be connected. They can put an ad in front of my face, and I might click it. But obviously, there's a lot of potential information, even without neural data, that we are contributing about ourselves and about our kind of our mental states, our health
Yeah.
problems, our lives, and our things that we would not necessarily want to have made public. Um, Now, on top of that, when you think about neural data, so if you like collect with have some electrodes built into a cap or something like that, that's really not invasive. This is not going to harm your brain, and they're picking up changes, kind of oscillations, changes in activity on a gross scale beneath your scalp. Um, the thing about these kinds of data, even these non-invasive forms of collection of data, is that as more of it is collected, and just to give a context, this is kind of one direction that many tech companies are exploring, is can we create kind of some sort of a worn device that will allow you to sort of do stuff with your thoughts, so
Hmm.
that rather than having to type with your hands, you can think what you want to type and it can happen. And there's a certain appeal to that we could then have this sort of seamless dialogue with our online world. But as I said, like if you are collecting information and especially sharing it with these companies that already have so much other information about you, that is kind of enabling them to use that data and feed it into a machine learning algorithm. These are kind of algorithms that are able to learn from giant amounts of data and detect patterns, and then in a new data set be able to say, aha, this person is somebody who has depression, or this is someone who's about to develop Parkinson's. Or so you can there's a lot of potential for health privacy information, and other personal information to kind of the privacy to erode if we go down that path. So I think just that we as consumers should be thinking about how, if we were to, what kind of devices we want to be wearing or engaging with, and what companies we want to give that data to, and how whether we know what they are permitted to do with it. Um, and I think that kind of we as a society should be thinking about what kind of laws do we want to put into place to regulate how these data can be used, because we do regulate things like health information and how that can be shared. So we could do the same for neural data.
Wow, that's impressive. Thank you so much for that. And it makes me just my mind is wandering all over the place, because you think that these companies only sell us the benefit, right? You're going to be able to speak telepathically with other people. You're going to be able to do whatever with your thoughts. You're going to be able to live in the metaverse. Why not? And they don't speak on the risk, the downsides. And it's important, as you really put it right now, and you write in Brainscapes, that we should ask questions on why are they selling the benefits, and why are they not talking about the risks, the privacy issues, and how comfortable are we in doing and being partaking these technologies, and what does that mean in our social interactions, in the way we develop, and putting it out there, philosophically speaking, what about free will? If I have every single piece of information being shared to these technology companies, and the first thing in the morning that I do is scroll on Twitter, and they know what I'm thinking on, they may nudge me to buy this certain product. They may nudge me to act on a certain behavior. So these kind of issues are very important to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add, with um, not long ago, we actually have ongoing issues with our kind of elections being meddled with, because already people can be manipulated online even without neural data, that we can influence what others are thinking, spread misinformation, or detect when people are most susceptible to be influenced by information
Mm.
or misinformation, and that can drive them to make choices that they wouldn't otherwise make. And so if you then compound that with, for example, having information about like, oh, this person is now in a sleepy state or this person is feeling sad, that's a great time to pop in with some information that you can try to manipulate them with. That there's a lot of potential harm there for ourselves and for our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's right now we're in the Pandora's box process of internet. Everything is happening. Everyone is partaking on it, and hopefully, with people like you leading the way in the conversation, we can just sway it into a more productive and positive one for all, not just one driven by, you know, corporate greed or whatever agenda anyone can have, because the true potential that your work sheds on how the mind works can be used to tap into helping so many people. But on the downside, if we're driven by other non-virtuous ideas and notions of the world, it can go into a different place. But I really like, you know, talking about this with you. And as you write in your book, any book worth reading should change how the reader experiences the world, even if it only does that by a little. And this will do it in a large scale, at least for me, and hopefully by to our listeners. But switching up gears a bit because I went very deep there. How do you think your book, Brainscapes, can help us, leverage the maps in our brain in our daily lives to better function and have a healthier experience with life?
That's a great question. So I think that one of the things um, that I think is helpful when you kind of understand why you perceive the way that you do, and if you appreciate that we are doing all that we do with this limited, a head that's smaller than a soccer ball and a brain that, it's a very finite thing, right? And we ask a lot of it and it performs as well as it can, but there are limitations and those limitations create ways in which we are more likely to be able to kind of comprehend and learn and ways that kind of are more challenging. So part of that I think one thing to do is to appreciate, give yourself forgiveness that a lot of things in everyday life are challenging, and that we didn't evolve to have brains that could do this, nor were we as babies tasked with doing this in a way that allowed us to develop that kind of rich architecture. But nonetheless, we do have this great potential to sort of harness the resources that we have at our fingertips, and that allows us to learn new things throughout life. And if you kind of know, for example, how we use the kind of existing structure to imagine things, to kind of create new things and learn new things and understand new abstract concepts based on sort of these physical maps and these analogies that we create to allow us to align different concepts. That can be very helpful for setting about learning something new and recognizing how you build upon the things you've learned before, and maybe turning something into a visual, kind of into a map, like a graph, or maybe building something physical of it that you can kind of see it, you can touch it, you can engage with it, or you can kind of relate it to your body. These different ways that we can think about complex things. Those are strategies that are tried and true, and that your brain is kind of prepared to receive. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's an absolute gem of wisdom, and really, in a practical sense, as we were discussing, our brain is billions of years in the making, and it has this evolutionary code, these maps that are way past us, so that we can even comprehend the magnitude of it all. Nonetheless, we live in a technological world where everything is exponential, and this dissonance between our minds, our brains making sense of it all, while having access to survival skills, I would argue, so we can have any piece of information we have that would enhance our survival in this internet of things. And this paradox of trying to not be overstimulated while our brain unconsciously, given its survival needs, wants to because it's receiving so much information into how the world works and what some potential risks slash benefits can come from reality. So having these tools, as you were arguing, to try to just take a step back and appreciate the power our mind has and our brain has, rather than feeling um, with information overload, can really help us a lot. So yes, Becca, I love this conversation. I really, truly hope all of our listeners take a deep dive into it and appreciate the work that you're doing. Is there anything else that you would like to add in our conversation that we didn't touch on?
Um, I think I will just add one of the things that I kind of mentioned earlier, but I want to drive home, which is that even though our brains are modest and small and physical things, um, I think the more you learn about how they work and how they represent our world and create it, the more wonder it fills you with. They really are just small miracles, and it's been my pleasure to kind of study the brain, and to also be able to kind of share these aspects of brain function with other people. So thank you for spreading the word.
No, thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to do so. And as you were mentioning right now, it's just these little miracles, such as neurons, screaming, as you say in your book, for our attention, like pick me, no, pick me. It's really, really impressive, and I do hope that we choose to tap into these potential technological advancements to leverage our society into a more responsible one, more equitable, more virtuous, because it really has the potential. Our brain is really a map of a treasure, and it's our responsibility to truly bring it to light. So, with your work, I'm sure we will do it. And thank you so much for joining me today, Rebecca.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.